Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think we should begin our proceedings and our conference. I'm Adam Mosley. I'm the local organiser of this annual meeting of the British Society for the History of Science. I'd like to welcome those of you who are Society members and participants in the conference to Swansea, and those of you who are members of the university or residents of Swansea who are here because we have enticed you with our splendid plenary lecture, which is all about Swansea and science. Before we get to our main event, I would like to introduce a number of individuals who, in their own way, have welcomes for you. So I would like to begin by introducing Pro Vice-Chancellor Iwan Davies to speak on behalf of the university.
Wel, yn gyntaf, croeso I Brifysgol Abertawe, croeso Twym Galon, a hefyd croeso o'r gwaelod calon I chi ac i'r gynhadledd yma, a prynhawn yma. It is a particular pleasure for me on behalf of Swansea University to formally welcome you both personally as delegates and, of course, to welcome you as the Society of the History of Science Conference here to the Swansea University. Swansea as a place was described by perhaps one of the greatest historians of his generation, Sir Glanmor Williams, as, of all the cities and towns of Wales, Swansea has a history unsurpassed in length, importance, variety, and interest. So you come to a place of great historic significance and particular significance in the history of science. After all, this is the home of the Royal Institute of South Wales, which was established in 1841. This is the home where we had the first science curriculum university established in the Knoll in Neath in 1857, the Western University of Great Britain, which only lasted for a year. But it is and has been described as the intelligent town, a town inspired by industry, perhaps the historic heart of the metallurgical industry, which fueled the Industrial Revolution. This university, however, like many of the great civic universities in England, owes its very existence to the efforts of industrialists such as Gilbertson, such as Sir Alfred Mond and Herbert Eccles. In the inaugural lecture of Sibley, the first Franklin Sibley, the first principal of Swansea University in 1921, Sibley noted the significance of science, the leaders of science, and particularly the leaders of the metallurgical industry who were supporters of this university. He said this: "We intend to justify the confidence and support and to break new ground whenever that is essential to the making of a closer connection between the university and industry and science." And I'm pleased to welcome you at this particular time in the words of Franklin Sibley, because this university is at the cusp of doing something very exceptional in its history. Over the next few months, we will be opening a new science and innovation campus at the Bay here in Swansea Bay. And it is particularly appropriate that at this time we should be welcoming the British Society of Science to History of Science to this university. It is a time for reflection. It is a time to understand our past, because surely in our past the future is firmly understood. Thank you so much.
As local organiser, I would like to gratefully acknowledge the support of two organisations, financial support of the College of Arts and Humanities of Swansea University and of the Learned Society of Wales. And I would like to introduce now Professor John Tucker of Swansea University and the London Society to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the Society.
The Learned Society of Wales was launched in May 2010. Its purpose is to represent excellence in scholarship and research. Essentially, work in Wales or by people who are Welsh or associated closely with Wales. Being founded in May 2010 is an interesting point, because our role model is, of course, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which is the Scottish Academy for Science and Letters, which was founded in 1783. We in Wales take a little while to get the early innovators out of the way, but it seems to have caught on, and so we're having a go too. Our first president was Sir John Cadogan, some of whom you may well know. He was an organic chemist of great distinction and became the director of research for BP for 13 years, commanding many laboratories and many thousands of research engineers, all of whom were privatized by Lord Brown in the various deals that came later on. He also then became the first Director General of the Research Councils, a man of enormous experience in British science and also international global science, largely connected with energy. I'm sure historians of science in future generations will find his archives and his activities of some interest. So much for our first president. Our second president was also a scientist, theoretical physicist, Sir American John Parry, who, after his scientific career, joined the diplomatic service and was our permanent representative on the UN Security Council in 2003, which admirably equips him to be president in a country like Wales, made up as it is of various tribes running around enjoying the benefits of a devolved nation. So, anyway, all this is relevant because you are here in Wales, and you should enjoy that experience if it's the first time. More importantly, when the Society was founded in May 2010, we decided on one or two things we wanted to do, and foremost among them was a whole program devoted to the history of science, technology, engineering, and medicine in Wales. Many people who are interested in these things tend to take a lifetime to find out about them, because so much of the knowledge is passed on orally from one enthusiast to another. And the written record does exist, very scattered, often quite difficult to find before the advent of large electronic libraries accessible via the web. But even then, very difficult. And we've done a great deal since that time. The Society has invested in all sorts of meetings and events. It's promoted the creation of reading lists and bibliographies, and launched, with the help of the University of Wales Press, a series on the scientists of Wales, which has currently 6 contracts let to various figures who will be, I assume, quite household names anyway. Anyway, institutions and societies. When I started my own personal journey to put together a history of science in Wales, my own curiosity, I came across various interesting books, not least History of Science in the Netherlands by Klaas van Bakel. And I found in there a very nice and obvious statement, which I'm sure many people would agree. Institutions are the terra firma under the feet of those who investigate the history of science in a particular country. An offhand remark, but one that is as important to a country that is growing its own identity and history as it would be to a mature country like the British Isles, which has the Royal Society and any number of fascinating institutions, current and defunct. We hope the Learned Society of Wales will prove to be a very significant and long-lasting institution, and one which will not only support people interested in aspects of the history of science in Wales, And anyone here who might be interested in availing themselves of some support from us, please come and see me. And also that, of course, the work that we do enters into some sort of historical canon. Finally, on the theme of institutions, Iwan briefly mentioned previously the founding of the Royal Institution of South Wales. Also, there are many members of council and members of the institution founded here in the early part of the 19th century present today. And so it's going to be a very special occasion for us to hear Iwan speak on this subject. So I hope you have a marvelous time and that you come away with a feeling that there's a huge hidden treasure trove of knowledge and information to be found here in Wales. Thank you very much.
And now we begin to get to the society business proper. And to kick us off in style, I would like to introduce Professor Greg Raddick of the University of Leeds, who is the president of the British Society for the History of Science.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. As Adam says, I'm Greg Raddick. I'm currently very proud to be the president of the British Society for the History of Science. And on behalf of the Society, I'd like to thank Pro Vice Chancellor Davis and Professor Tucker for your warm welcomes and also for the financial contributions in support of this conference. We're most grateful. I'd also, on behalf of the Society, like to welcome all of you to this special event marking the start of our 2015 annual Congress, our annual meeting. It's a central element of the vision of the British Society for the History of Science as it edges towards its 70th year, that the history of science, technology, and medicine is far too important, certainly to leave to scientists, but even to leave to historians of science. It belongs to everybody. It's a shared heritage, and it's all the more a pleasure and a duty to bring the best of recent research before the widest possible audience as often as we can. And so I'm delighted this evening to be introducing our speaker, Professor Iwan Morus. Iwan is Aberystwyth born and bred. Over the course of his career, he's been briefly exiled in places such as Cambridge and San Diego and Belfast. But he is now safely back as professor of history at Aberystwyth University. He enjoys enormous esteem within the field for his achievements under several headings. As a groundbreaking researcher in the history of Victorian electricity, as an editor of one of the most important journals of the field, History of Science. He's only recently hung up his spurs there. As co-author with Peter Bowler, a former colleague from Belfast, of what is easily the most successful textbook in the field, Making Modern Science, published with Chicago University Press. But finally, and maybe most relevantly this evening, for his prolific abilities and achievements as a gifted expositor of the history of science for general audiences, both on the page and on the platform, even on television. And so today, on the day that the British Society for the History of Science comes to Swansea, I'd like to invite you to join me in welcoming Iwan to tell us about the day the Bass came to Swansea, 1848, and all that. So over to Iwan.
Wel, diolch yn fawr, Greg, am y geiriau caredig yna. A diolch yn fawr hefyd i'r gymdeithas a chyngor y gymdeithas am yng ngwadd i yma i draddodi'r ddarlith fawr gyntaf yn y gynhadledd yma. And I suppose I'd probably better start speaking English now, hadn't I? Otherwise there might be problems. In the middle of August 1848, the British Association for the Advancement of Science arrived in Swansea for its annual gathering. That picture, that's not just Swansea in 1848, that's Swansea in August 1848. It's a coloured version of of a lithograph that was published in the Illustrated London News on August the 19th, 1848. So it was probably actually drawn when the BSHS was here. So middle of August 1848, the BSHS arrive in Swansea. It rained. As those of you who live here already know, and as the rest of you are in the process of finding out, there are three sorts of weather in Swansea, and actually in Wales in general. It's either raining, or it's just stopped raining, or it's about to start raining. You'll be discovering this over the next few days. On the 9th of August, 1848, it was raining. This is the newspaper. The morning of the day upon which the British Association will hold its first meeting in Wales opens gloomily. The rain pours down in torrents and has a depressing influence upon the prospects of this interesting occasion, one to which the country has looked forward with that interest which ever attaches itself to events which, from their importance, become epochs in the life of a nation, in the history of a people or a race. Despite the rain, as the newspaper carried on to explain, on the meeting's first day, a large number of persons, including many distinguished visitors, as well as the gentry and principal inhabitants of Swansea and the neighbouring districts, availed themselves of the opportunity of becoming members of the association. When the reception room was closed on Wednesday evening, the total number of members enrolled was 575, of which 149 were ladies. This was the BSHS's first visit to Wales, just as this is the BSHS's first visit to Wales. The BSHS would not hold another meeting in Wales, and indeed, in fact, they came to Swansea again, until 1880. I sincerely hope the BSHS will manage to do a little bit better than that. The association's visit to the town that was busily trying to promote itself as the Welsh metropolis offers a good way of approaching the place of science in Welsh culture. What, if anything, was Welsh about the 1848 meeting? And what place did science occupy in Welsh efforts to define themselves? It's worth remembering just what a crucial, important period we're talking about here in Welsh history. The decades leading up to 1848 had been particularly bloody and turbulent ones in Wales. New elites were jostling for political and economic power. The Merthyr Rising, when the red flag, red because it's been dipped in blood before being raised up. You probably don't know, this is when the red flag was first raised. This is where the red flag comes from Merthyr in 1831. The red flag was first raised as a symbol of resurrection. It was less than 2 decades past. The Chartists' armed rebellion in Newport, when more than 20 people died in a shootout between rebels and troops, taking place less than a decade previously. The Rebecca riots of only a few years previously, when armed men dressed as the hosts of Rebecca attacked and burned turnpikes across West and South Wales, were very, very fresh indeed in Swansea memories in 1848. Coming at things from a slightly different direction, only the previous year, only in 1847, the year before, the publication of the Royal Commissioner's report on the state of education and morals in Wales, Brad y Llyfrau Gleision, we call it, the treason of the Blue Books. This wholesale attack on Welsh culture had provoked outrage as well as much agonising about the state of the nation and its place in Britain. This was the bloody context for the Swansea meeting. The BSHS's arrival in town on the 9th of August 1848 was the culmination of several years of planning and negotiation. In 1846, the council minutes for the Southampton meeting of the association notes that, and I quote, that a deputation had been appointed by the mayor and corporation of Swansea, the principal inhabitants, magistracy, and country gentlemen of the neighbourhood, and by the members of the Royal Institution of South Wales, to attend the meeting at Southampton for the purpose of inviting the British Association to hold their annual meeting at Swansea at as early a period as may suit their convenience. Some council members thought that this little town on the edges of civilization simply did not have the resources to host such a gathering. The BSHS's secretary, John Phillips, was instructed to visit, I quote, for the purpose of examining and reporting on its means of public and private accommodation. Phillips duly did so and reported back to the Oxford meeting the following year that the inquiry which you requested me to make as to the accommodation which might be found in Swansea for a meeting of the British Association has been rendered comparatively easy and capable of an accurate answer. The excellent arrangement of Mr. Grove and the zealous assistance of his friends of Swansea ensured that suitable accommodation for the public purposes of the association could be found at the Royal Institution, the Town Hall, theatre, and certain large schoolrooms. So they came. The Marquis of Northampton, chosen as the association's president for that year, in his presidential address on the meeting's opening day, offered one reading, at least, of what the BSHS's visit to Swansea signified. Northampton made it quite clear to his audience what a favour it was, the BSHS, to visit a location, as he put it, so remote from the metropolis, remote from the chief seats of English learning, remote also from those great highways of communication by which modern ingenuity has almost accomplished the extravagant wish of annihilating space and time. It was clear from Northampton's speech, with his comparison with the previous year's meeting at Oxford, that in his view, at any rate, the BSHS was in Swansea to instruct rather than to be instructed. Oxford was a place where, he said, during the lapse of many centuries, science and learning have made their abode, and where religion has consecrated their union. Swansea, by implication, was not. It had no native talent to compare. It was in a corner, as it were, of Great Britain, and separated from the highways of steam. Northampton frankly warned his audience not to expect too much from the meeting. Swansea cannot, with reason, expect a meeting as numerous as those of York and Cambridge and Oxford, and still less like those that congregated at Liverpool and Glasgow. 38 years later, when the BSHS returned to Swansea and to Wales, some commentators had clearly not forgotten the president's disdain for the occasion. Northampton, they said, did not regard Swansea with a favourable eye when comparing the old town with the Gothic towers of Oxford, in which the conference took place the year before. As it turns out, and I'll come back to this at rather greater length later, Northampton had his own rather peculiar reasons for damning Swansea's prospects with faint praise. Others, of course, read and tried to represent the meeting differently. Scientific activity played an important role in the civic culture of local Swansea elites already. Men such as Lewis Weston Dilwyn, owner of the Cambrian Pottery Works, and his son, John Dilwyn Llywelyn, or the copper magnate, John Henry Vivian, and William Robert Grove, of course, were leading fellows of the Royal Society. They had all played an important role in establishing the Royal Institution of South Wales a decade or so earlier, and the Royal Institution of South Wales itself, would play an important role in the plans to bring the BSHS to Swansea. Both as a group, anxious to promote Swansea as the leading town in Wales, and as individuals keen to maintain and advance their positions on local and national stages, these men wanted to recruit the BSHS to their cause. The campaign to get the British ass to town and the effort to put on a good show for the visitors provided opportunities for uniting the town's factions for a common cause and for demonstrating a shared appetite for improvement. Now, on the 12th of September 1846, the Cambrian newspaper informed its readers that, and I quote, "South Wales has been honoured with a meeting of this learned body much sooner than could have been expected." They reported that memorials from the corporation, neighbouring gentlemen, Royal Institution, etc., most respectably and numerously signed, were forwarded to Southampton for presentation by W.R. Grove, Esquire, FRS, urging the claims of South Wales and of Swansea in particular to host a meeting of the BSHS as soon as practicable. A letter newly arrived from Grove himself explained that, and I quote, the meeting, is to go to Oxford next year, where Grove had himself been a student, but I'm happy to say that we may confidently expect to visit Swansea in 1848. The approach to the BSHS's Council of the Southampton meeting had clearly been a carefully planned affair. Phillips, in his report on Swansea's suitability as host, noted that a meeting of the association at Swansea would have been quite impracticable, but for the prior establishment and creditable support of the Royal Institution of South Wales, which is here in operation. He was impressed by the strength of united public feeling, which was at present times undoubtedly strong and in the right direction, and there is reason to believe it will remain so. The main driving force behind the Swansea invitation was William Robert Grove himself. Now, gentlemen, my hero over there. Like other key players in the campaign to bring the British ass to Swansea, Grove was a member of a well-established and influential local clan. John mentioned the ongoing project, sort of started by the Learned Society of Wales, going to be published by the University of Wales Press, to sort of publish little biographies of scientists of Wales. I'm writing one of them, and I'm writing it on Grove. And it's a fascinating process for finding out quite a lot about the well-established and influential local clan that was the Groves. I'm still finding out more as we go along. His father, John Grove, was a wealthy and connected local merchant who in turn serves as a magistrate, deputy lieutenant of Glamorganshire, as well as several times Portreeve and mayor of Swansea. His uncles, Thomas and William Robert was clearly a family name, were themselves also town councillors and aldermen like their brothers, and Thomas, the other brother, had also served as Portreeve of Swansea. The family were deeply involved in the cultural and political life of Swansea during the first half of the 19th century. Grove himself, of course, was a prominent fellow of the Royal Society, having been elected in 1840 in the aftermath of his invention of the nitric acid battery. Until his resignation in 1846, he'd been Professor of Experimental Philosophy at the London Institution. With his combination of local and metropolitan family, philosophical and professional networks, he was particularly well placed to present Swansea's claims to the BSHS's council. He was attending at Southampton, in any case, as Vice President of the Chemical Section, and actually as the President of the Chemical Section for that year was him over there, Michael Faraday, for those of you who don't recognise him. And Faraday didn't actually, as it turns out, go to the Southampton BSHS meeting. Grove was de facto the President of the Chemical Section that year. And when it came to the Swansea meeting itself, Grove was the Vice President with Northampton as President. You will soon get to realise how deeply ironic that was. And he was Vice President along with Henry de la Beach, who was working in Swansea at this time with the Geological Survey, and Lewis Weston Dillwyn and John Henry Vivian, among others. Actually, I should note at this point, for those of you who aren't from Swansea and who kind of wander around some of these local streets, you will be walking along streets with names like Bellabesh Street, Bilwyn Road, Vivian Street. Now, these are the clans and dynasties that run Swansea when this, when these events take place. The Dilwyn family, like the Groves, was a well-entrenched and influential dynasty. Lewis had made his fortune in the pottery trade. He had also married well, so he'd married into local gentry, marrying Mary Adams, the illegitimate daughter of a prominent local landowner, Colonel John Llewellyn, in 1807. Illegitimate Mary may have been, but she was clearly acknowledged by her father, since she and through her their son, John Dilwyn Llewellyn, inherited Colonel John Llewellyn's estates, and it was to mark that John Dilwyn Llewellyn became John Dilwyn Llewellyn rather than John Dilwyn. It seems to have been a habit of that particular family to marry well. I can't remember the details off the top of my head, but I think either John Dilwyn Llewellyn's son or one of his grandsons, again, married well and added yet another hyphen to the name to mark the fact that they'd come into yet more money by marriage. Dilwyn was High Sheriff of Glamorganshire in 1818, was elected as the county MP to the first Reformed Parliament in 1832, and in 1839 he was mayor of, he was a mayor of Swansea. Vivian, similarly, was the first MP elected to the Reformed Parliament for the borough of Swansea, and like John Grove, was Deputy Lieutenant of Glamorganshire, as well as a councillor for the Reformed Corporation of Swansea, that was created in 1835. When Vivian died in 1855, he was replaced as Swansea's MP by John Dilwyn Llewellyn, Lewis Weston Dilwyn's son. I hope you're by now getting the sense of intertwined and influential and wealthy local dynasties that I'm trying to kind of sketch for you here. Vivian and both of the Dilwyns were FRSs as well. Families like the Dilwyns, Groves, and Vivians were tied together by networks of relationships and mutual interest. As I said, John Dilwyn Llewellyn inherited his maternal grandfather's county estate at Penllergaer in this part of the world, changing his name, as I said, and himself married into the vastly wealthy and politically influential Talbot clan. We're talking here about Talbot as in photography, and Port Talbot as in just down the road, steelworks. That's the Talbots for you. John Dilwyn Llewellyn, as a local magistrate, had played an important role in suppressing the Rebecca riots. In a pocketbook that he kept throughout these years, he recorded, for example, on one occasion, how he persuaded a local radical, of all people, to join an armed posse. And when I'm talking about things like blood on the streets and armed posses, don't think that I'm being metaphorical. I'm not. I'll be metaphorical with blood later on. Right now, it's real blood. It's real guns. He persuaded a local radical to join an armed posse out hunting for rioters. Okay. I told him that I agreed with him, the radical that is, that there had been grievances in Carmarthenshire which ought to be remedied, and that I'd be the foremost to assist in any reasonable reform, but that the law must be vindicated and the present lawlessness put down promptly if they had grown to dangerous proportions. There were times when the Dilwyn families really thought that they would have to abandon their estates at Penllergaer, which is it's on the outskirts of Swansea. It's on the western outskirts of Swansea, quite close to Carmarthenshire, because they thought that the house itself might be attacked by the hosts of Rebecca. Dilwyn Llewellyn's brother-in-law, Matthew Moggridge, also a magistrate and also one of the local secretaries for the Swansea meeting, led similar kinds of sorties against the rioters. And if this sounds quite far away from meetings of the BSHS 2 or 3 years later in 1848, I think one of the points I want to make is that it isn't. One way of understanding the invitation to the BSHS to come to Swansea is as another attempt both at imposing order and actually mending fences with other radical elements. Because often, clans like the Dilwyns, the Vivians, the Groves, I'm not quite so sure about. They hang around the Dilwyns, I'm sure. Dilwyns and Vivians, they probably are. These are liberals. These are, in their own terms, politically radical, but not so radical that they're going to be on the wrong side of the barricades when you're sort of shooting at men dressed in women's clothes. So inviting the BSHS here, it's a way of demonstrating civility, it's a way of demonstrating order, and it's a way of building fences with other radical groups that have their own interests in science. In Swansea and in other places across Wales, newly empowered elites like this wanted to transform themselves, their towns and cities, and Wales itself, along with its place in the hierarchy of empire. Suppressing rioters was one way of doing that. Getting the BSHS to Swansea was another. Wales, and South Wales in particular, had already a long tradition that associated natural philosophy with religious and political dissent. The 18th century radical tradition, represented by Richard Price, born in Llangaenor near Bridgend, some 25 miles from Swansea, remained active, very active, during the early decades of the 19th century. By the 1830s, literary and scientific institutions were proliferating across Wales. Neath had one of the earliest, followed by, not to be outdone by Neath, Swansea, within a matter of months, really, Merthyr, Cardiff, in quick succession. And these scientific societies played key roles in furthering civic ambitions on small and large scales. They offered opportunities for individual self-fashioning as well as civic improvement. They provided a forum for efforts at reconfiguring political divisions too. And I think we'll briefly leave Swansea now. The example of the Merthyr Literary and Scientific Institution is a good one in this respect. The Merthyr Institution is established in 1837. This is barely 6 years after the bloody events of the Merthyr Rising and their consequences. Imagine thinking, you're back in 1831, troops firing at the crowd, yelling, "Causgadabara! Causgadabara!" They're demanding the completely outrageous demand that they actually be paid enough to be able to afford to have cheese with their bread. That's Causgadabara! 20 of them were killed before, unsurprisingly, the crowd started firing back at the troops. So the Merthyr Society, which is one of the earliest instances of these new literary and scientific societies that are founded across Wales, and it shows how very, very specific local circumstances can inform the form and origins of these institutions. See, the first report, the first suggestion of the society should be founded as a report in the Merthyr Guardian. The public meeting held at the Bush by Guest. Guest was the owner of the local ironworks, that's the Dowlais Ironworks, and of course, following the Reform Act of 1832, the town's Whig MP. The meeting at the Bush concluded that, and I quote, that it is expedient to establish in Merthyr Tydfil a literary and scientific institution which shall have for its object the dissemination of useful and practical knowledge to the various classes in this great manufacturing district. A committee is duly established. The Welsh do this a lot. What are we going to do? Let's have a committee. Its members included, amongst others, a Baptist minister a local doctor, solicitor William Merrick, and the radical and soon-to-be local Chartist leader Morgan Williams. The secretaries are Edward Lewis Richards and Taliesin Williams. None of these names mean anything terribly much to you, so I'll say a little bit about them. So at first, the list reads like a gathering of local reform-minded moderates and radicals, just the sort of people that had joined forces from the 1820s onwards to campaign for parliamentary reform. The Merthyr case is made more interesting, however, by the fact that these were men who certainly would have been quite literally on different sides of the barricades a few years earlier, before they rallied around the banner of science. Merrick was solicited William Crawshay, another big local ironworks owner, prominent in local politics in defence of his patron's interest, and had contested Merthyr actually against Guest on a pro-church Tory ticket in 1834. So that's one side. Morgan Williams had been involved in radical politics from an early age and was a co-editor of the radical newspaper Y Gweithiwr, the Workman. Taliesin Williams, who was the son of the prominent antiquarian, self-proclaimed Jacobin, and inventor of the gorsedd, Iolo Morgannwg. Himself, he's a local schoolmaster, Unitarian, and again, moderate defender of unions and workmen's rights. The other secretary, Edward Lewis Richards, comes with similar credentials. So these are people who are shooting at each other a few years before, not to put too fine a point in it. The aspiration that scientific societies might offer an antidote to political sectarianism crops up elsewhere too. Remarking on the foundation of the Neath Museum and Society for Promoting the Arts and Sciences in 1835, the Tory-leaning Merthyr Guardian commented that it is always pleasing to see men of various political opinions joining hand and heart in the noble object of the cultivation of the arts and sciences and the intellectual and moral improvement of those around them. Respectability is a common theme here. When the Dean of Llandaff, William Conybeare, for example, lectured to the Neath Society a little after its founding in 1835, the Cambrian newspaper, that's the Swansea rag for the period, was keen to emphasise that the audience consisted of, and I quote, of about 400 of the leading families and respectable inhabitants of the town of Neath and the western parts of the county. And it was the success of the Neath initiative that provided the immediate inspiration for Swansea's civic elites to set up a scientific society. The Swansea Literary and Philosophical Society, founded later in 1885, had the usual Dilwins, Groves, and Vivians, amongst others, amongst its founders. And it was an expression of that elite network's ambitions for themselves and their town. And that vision was soon to be embodied in the Royal Institution of South Wales. That's it, and its impressive neoclassical facade. It's still there. Quite amazingly, given the Luftwaffe's efforts in Swansea, the Royal Institution of South Wales building is still there. It's now the Swansea Museum, and if you have any spare moments, you should wander further down the road. It's not that far away from here. It's a sight worth seeing. It looks a little incongruous, I always think, in its current setting. But I have a feeling that it always did look a little incongruous in its current setting, and that was actually part of the whole point of the exercise. So that's the building. The institution's backers acquired a royal charter in 1838, and on the 24th of August that year, the foundation stone of the new building was laid by the president, Lewis Weston Dilwyn. I'll let you read that for yourself. It was a public and ceremonial occasion. The architectural embodiment of the town's enthusiasm for scientific culture was meant to signal its leading role in national culture, too. And it was entirely in keeping with the local elite's ambition to establish Swansea as the Welsh metropolis, their language, not mine. The BAAS's visit should indeed be represented as being as much a national as a civic event. Newspaper advertisements soliciting funds for the occasion were addressed to the nobility, clergy, magistrates, and all other inhabitants of the Principality who intend to contribute to the fund for defraying the expenses of receiving the British Association. And the published lists of subscribers do suggest that even if most of those who contribute to the funds were from Swansea, there were at least some responses from further afield, with subscriptions coming in from Cardiff, Carmarthen, and Haverfordwest, for example. And the BSHS's own leadership were clearly keen to promote the visit as a national event. Addressing the local committee a month before the meeting, John Phillips, the BSHS's secretary, suggested that, and I quote, "The expectation the approaching meeting might be regarded as truly a meeting for Wales was entirely justified, as he offered advice with the sole object of rendering this the first visit to Wales of the association creditable to the town of Swansea, to the neighbourhood, and to the Principality." His description of the forthcoming visit, clearly underplaying things a bit, as the most important event in the recent history of the Principality. This was fully in keeping with his host's ambitions. Now, William Robert Grove's acknowledged position as the key figure in Swansea's efforts to attract the BSHS, and everybody at the time says it's Grove what did it, suggests that own interests might bear closer examination. Grove was at an interesting intersection in his career during the second half of the 1840s, moving between London and Wales, and between his professional life as a barrister and his philosophical vocation. Grove had been active in metropolitan scientific circles since the mid-1830s. He'd played a leading role, as I said, in establishing the Swansea Literary and Scientific Institution, and by the time that society was transformed into the Royal Institution of South Wales, Grove was a member of the council and sat on the building committee, so forth. At the London Institution, there, Grove was, well, rather, Grove had been by this stage, in a position rivaling that of Michael Faraday at the Royal Institution. He certainly had access to resources in terms of laboratory, lecture room, and apparatus, which would have been the envy of many of his scientific contemporaries. Nevertheless, in 1846, he abruptly relinquished his professorship, citing the need to support his growing family and the growing pressures of professional life. I'm inclined to doubt the excuse of needing to support his growing family, given on the one hand the wealth of the Grove family, and also the fact that Grove, the Swansea habit this clearly, had also married extremely well indeed. His wife, Maria Powles, was the daughter of John Diston Powles, who was an extremely wealthy and, as far as I know, fairly unscrupulous investor in South American enterprises. And it is clear that Grove was not entirely satisfied with the way his life in science was developing. In a Welshman's broadside against metropolitan corruption, published in Blackwood's magazine a few years before this, Grove railed against the scientific snobs who, he said, and I quote, "do harm by the cliquery which they generate, collecting little knots of little men, no individual of whom can stand on his own ground, but a group of whom, by leaning hard together, can and do exercise a most pernicious influence, seeking petty gain and class celebrity. They exert their joint stock brains to convert science into pounds, shillings, and pence. And once they have managed to poke one foot on the ladder of notoriety, use the other to kick furiously at the poor aspirants who attempt to follow them." Somebody had annoyed him. In May 1846, just as he was in the process of resigning his London Institution chair, and presumably preparing the case he would place before the British Ass, proposing the Swansea meeting, Grove was appointed to the Royal Society's Charter Committee. Sounds innocuous. He was soon hip deep in blood, metaphorical this time, we've done the real blood, as he took the lead in efforts to reform the society and oust the ancien regime resistant to reform, including, of course, the then president of the Royal Society, the Marquis of Northampton. The question of reform had been a festering sore in the Royal Society's side ever since Sir Joseph Banks' death in 1820 brought his 40-year presidency to an end. Nobody dared cross Banks, but once Banks was gone, then there's a flood of attempts at reform. Following the Radicals' first defeat in 1830, when the astronomer John Herschel was beaten to the presidency by the Royal Duke of Sussex, reformist discontent had more or less gone underground until the middle of the 1840s. Then Grove and his fellow conspirators decided it was time to lance the boil. The innocuous sounding Charter Committee was initially established to investigate ways of making the administration of the Society by its officers easier to manage. With Grove on board, its remit to examine the current state of the Charter and statutes and report on their suitability of the current state of the Society was turned into a powerful weapon for reform. He and his allies in the Charter Committee, particularly the geologist and warden of the London University, Leonard Horner, and the Royal Society's Foreign Secretary, Edward Sabine, used the opportunity to push through proposals that severely constrained the Society's officers and president's powers of patronage, and limited the number of new fellows that could be elected each year to 15 to be nominated by the council. There's basically, you cut the council, you cut the president's ability basically to make his buddies fellows of the Royal Society. That's what they did. Somehow, they succeeded in packing the council meeting with their backers and got their reforms through in the face of furious opposition, led by the Society's secretary, Peter Mark Roget, that's Thesaurus to you, and the Marquis of Northampton. Northampton publicly dissociated himself from the new regime when he told the assembled fellows of the Society's anniversary meeting in November 1847 that, as he was one of those who entertained considerable doubts of its prudence and expediency. I cannot claim any praise should it prove advantageous to the Society, nor must I be considered responsible in case of failure. A year later, during his last address to the fellows before resigning in a huff, just a few months before the Swansea meeting, he continued to snipe at Grove and the other reformers. Limiting the number of fellows, he said, would deprive us of the power of publishing those transactions which constitute the main power of our scientific usefulness. The Society needed literary men, eminent artists, and gentlemen of rank and station among the fellowship. Their election, he said, had the important purpose of enlisting the cause of science, those who may patronize and defend, though they do not follow her. So when Northampton arrived in Swansea to preside over the meeting and deliver the annual presidential address, it was as an outgoing president of the Royal Society, and he knew that he had Grove, the Swansea meeting's main instigator, to blame for his situation. And Northampton's presidential address offered him an ideal opportunity to get his own back. His recital of Swansea's deficiencies as a venue, compared to the previous year's location in Oxford, was just the beginning. So why were they there? And I quote, "To those members who were at Southampton and Oxford, it would be quite superfluous to allude to the eloquent terms in which the advocate of Swansea, Professor Grove, like a potent magician, or like a representative of the bard and druids of ancient Britain, summoned us to the shores of the Bristol Channel." I mean, it's clear where this is coming from. I mean, the jibe is meant to remind his listeners, you know, Hotspur's reply to Glendower's boastful, "I can call spirits from the vasty deep." The response, "Well, so can I. Well, so can any man. But will they come when you do call them?" The BSHS had come, and only Grove's blandishments could have persuaded sober Englishmen to come to such a place, presumably just as only his glib tongue had persuaded the fellows of the Royal Society to give Northampton the boot. Grove himself, you remember was the vice president, when he rose to thank Northampton after the address, presumably did so through gritted teeth. So, the low expectations of some regarding the meeting's prospects had clearly registered. Looking back at the meeting after its end, the Merthyr Guardian was clear that it was very evident from the tenor of the remarks made by some of the officers of the British Association and the principal personages who were present at Swansea last week that they had anticipated a failure, but were most agreeably disappointed. And the newspaper made no secret as to its view of who was responsible for the triumph. He's given a dinner by the town. I'll leave you to read it. As an exercise in civic and individual self-fashioning, the Swansea meeting had clearly fulfilled its organisers' ambitions. So, what's going on? Preparing the town for the BSS's arrival required a great deal of organisation. John Phillips, in his report to the Council at Oxford, had noted that Swansea's hotels and public houses had sufficient accommodation for 400 people, and that local householders had offered accommodation for a further 200. So if you remember the figures of people who signed up, Swansea could just about accommodate the meeting of the BSHS. Northampton's suggestion that Swansea was separated from the highways of steam was not, in fact, wide of the mark. Brunel's Great Western Railway hadn't arrived, in fact, hadn't arrived anywhere near South Wales in 1848. The South Wales Railway would be completed 2 years later. Travellers coming to Swansea to the BSHS meeting had a choice of either taking the mail coach along the South Wales coast or, as most of them did, taking the train to Bristol and going by boat from there along the Channel to Swansea. Accommodation for the meeting itself was scattered throughout the town. This is the helpful map that they'd clearly prepared for the assembled throngs. Headquarters, predictably enough, were at the Royal Institution of South Wales, impressive building. I'm not going to bother. that black spot in the middle, which also played host to the chemistry section, the mathematics and physics section, was in the girls' school across the road, the black spot just above it. Geology was housed in the town hall. There. It's housed in the town hall a few streets away. And someone with a sense of humour had placed the statistics section in the card room of the assembly rooms. Just down there as well. And the organisers laid on squads of uniformed runners to carry messages between venues across the town. Meeting of the sections offered audiences plenty of opportunities to see some of the civic lions on stage. Those present at the mathematics and physics section on the first day could have enjoyed a set two between David Brewster and William Whewell on Berkeley's theory of vision, for example. The chemistry section, where both William Robert Grove and John Dillwyn Llewellyn were vice presidents, they could listen to Grove himself, the local boy made good, on the cooling effect of hydrogen in voltaic ignition. Lois Weston Dillwyn presided over the natural history section over at the assembly rooms. There are plenty of opportunities for less distinguished local men to have a chance of the limelight. Dillwyn's son-in-law, Matthew Moggridge, presented 2 cases of uncommon atmospheric refraction seen locally, while another member of the local committee, John Jenkins, lectured on his tide tables. Another Swansea man, Starling Benson, discussed South Wales coal deposits of the geological section. Over in the card room at the assembly rooms, where John Henry Vivian presided over the statisticians, Cadogan Williams talked about the desirableness of extending to the working classes the opportunity of purchasing deferred annuities as a provision for old age. For many, though, including some of the bigwigs, the real business of the meetings was the entertainment. The entries in Lois Weston Dillwyn's diary covering the meeting have more to say about the soirees and excursions or listing the celebrities invited to dinner than they do about the more strictly scientific performances. In his entry for Saturday, 12th of August, for example, he notes, went with my dear Mary, the bishop, etc., to John's display at Pentregair. John obviously being John Dillwyn Llywelyn. And this is a reference to that afternoon's excursion, that's the Saturday, to John Dillwyn Llywelyn's extensive gardens on the outskirts of Swansea. The association's members have been told that those who may not wish to go on the longer excursions will find the grounds of J.D. Llywelyn Esquire at Penllyn Gar open to them between 12 and 5 on Saturday. A boat impelled by the electrical current will be at work at one of the lakes. I think that's actually the wrong lake. There are two lakes in the gardens, an upper and a lower lake. Experiments took place in the lower lake, and I'm fairly sure that that's the upper lake. It's all still there. It's in the process of being renovated. If you have spare time, go to Penllyn Gar, walk around the lakes. The lakes are slightly rather smaller than they used to be, I'm told. And it'll give you a sense of just how rich these people were. Dillwyn Llywelyn had taken a large valley on the outskirts of Swansea and turned it into his own private garden. The electrical current for the experiment, for the electric boat, was, of course, provided by a battery of Grove's nitric acid cells. For those wanting to go further afield, there are trips laid on up the Swansea Valley to the Carrickenen Castle or to Ostlefera's Ironworks and to Danarogov Caves. And another excursion headed, of course, for the caves and cliffs of Gower. So let's start winding things up. Lewis Weston Dillwyn's diary entry for 19th of August noted the departure of the last of their guests, as he puts it, and thus our gaieties ended. The BSHS's visit had been a great success for its instigators. They had put Swansea on the scientific map as a place where science might be seen to be generated as much as a site for scientific missionary work. Swansea civic leaders, the men behind the invitation, had ambitious plans for their town. They wanted recognition for Swansea as the Welsh metropolis, and a successful visit from the BSHS could do a great deal to further those ambitions. An event like this offered opportunities for forging and consolidating alliances, rewarding supporters, settling old debts, good and bad, and building bridges. Individuals like Grove had clearly come out of it well too. He'd been feted by his fellow townsmen, seen his nitric acid battery in action on the lake at Penllyn Gar, and his prominence in the organisation of the Swansea event can have done his prestige on the metropolitan stage no harm. The meeting consolidated Grove's position and Swansea's place in a network of mutual scientific patronage and exchange that bridged metropolis and province. By the end of September, the metropolitan scientific gentlemen, with Grove among them, were back in London to resume the interrupted revolution in progress they had left behind them at the Royal Society. Now, the revolution of the Royal Society was not the only revolution that seemed to threaten in 1848. Of course, many of the scientific gentlemen at the Swansea meeting would, for example, have acted as special constables in April that year when London's Chartists gathered in their thousands on Kennington Common. The threat of revolution was still in the air in the autumn. And likening those with the transformation of the Royal Society or the Swansea to BSHS occasions is not completely off the mark either. Chartists would certainly have agreed with the Royal Society's reforming gentlemen on this, if nothing else, that the institutional state of science had consequences for the institution of the state. 18 years later, when Grove himself was delivering his own presidential address as president of the BSHS, in Nottingham this time, just as Northampton had no connection with Swansea, Grove had no connection with Nottingham either, but there we go. As he delivered his own presidential address, he argued that nature and society were continuous, the progress in each was best achieved incrementally. As he put it, in this country, practical experience has taught us to improve rather than to remodel. We follow the laws of nature and avoid cataclysms. That was what his reforms of the Royal Society were meant to offer, and that was how politics ought to be reformed as well. And instantly, it's in his, I think, Grove in his presidential address. He's I think he's the first president of the BSHS to basically come out in support of Darwin. We might understand the Swansea BSHS as part of a project to reform Welsh culture as well. It seems clear, as I said, that by the 1840s, that new civic elites who were playing an increasingly central role as cultural arbiters in Wales were turning to science as one way of refashioning themselves and of demonstrating their affiliation with progressive philosophy and politics. Inviting the BSHS to Swansea certainly signified civic ambition, but it also signalled an effort to redesign the nation and its culture too. The banner of science was a flag of convenience, under which some otherwise quite uneasy bedfellows could be made to march together. And it symbolised their adherence and their hopes of Welsh adherence to the imperial project. 38 years later, it won't be quite as long in our case, I hope, when the BSHS returned to Swansea and to Wales, the 1848 meeting still retained its standing as a marker of civic success. Its organisers knew there had been a social transformation in those intervening years. The BSHS meeting played its part in that cultural and political transformation. It marked an effort to make science Welsh as part of the process of making Wales part of Britain. Thank you.